What if everything you thought you knew about how Muslims view Jesus was incomplete or even wrong? And what if the truth was so surprising that it could completely change how Christians and Muslims see each other forever? Today's story begins with a moment that left thousands of Christians stunned, confused, and deeply curious, as a powerful speaker calmly revealed a side of Islam that most people in the West had never heard before, a side that speaks about Jesus not as an enemy, not as a false prophet, not as a forgotten figure, but as one of the most honored, respected, and beloved messengers of God in the entire Islamic tradition. The room was silent, the audience leaned forward, and you could almost feel the tension in the air when he said, "Muslims don't just acknowledge Jesus, they revere him." And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted. For years, many Christians had grown up believing that Islam rejects Jesus or sees him as insignificant. But the truth that unfolded was far more shocking and far more beautiful than anyone expected. He explained that in Islam, Jesus, known as Isa, peace be upon him, is not only mentioned in the Quran, but is mentioned with immense respect, praised for his miraculous birth, honored for his purity, and recognized as one of the greatest prophets ever sent to humanity. And as these words echoed through the hall, you could see disbelief on some faces, tears on others, and a growing realization that something deeply misunderstood had just been exposed. Then came the first jaw-dropping revelation. Muslims believe in the virgin birth of Jesus just as strongly as Christians do. And in fact, the Quran dedicates an entire chapter named after Mary, his mother, something even many Christians didn't know. And when this was said out loud, a wave of murmurs rippled through the audience because no one had ever told them that Mary is one of the most honored women in Islam, praised for her devotion, her faith, and her strength, chosen by God above all women of her time, and that Jesus was born to her through a divine miracle without any human father, a sign of God's limitless power. But that wasn't even the most shocking part, because as the explanation continued, he revealed that Islam teaches Jesus performed miracles by God's permission, healing the blind, curing the sick, and even raising the dead, and that these miracles are not denied or dismissed, but openly affirmed in the Quran. And when the audience heard this, many Christians looked at each other in disbelief, silently asking, "Why have we never heard this before?" The speaker paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in, and then asked a question that cut straight to the heart. If Muslims believe in the virgin birth of Jesus, honor his mother, accept his miracles, and revere him as one of God's greatest messengers, do we still think Islam is anti-Jesus? And suddenly, the walls of misunderstanding that had been built over decades started to crack because the truth was not what most people had been told. He then addressed the elephant in the room, the one belief that truly separates Christianity and Islam, the idea of Jesus as the Son of God. And instead of mocking or attacking this belief, he spoke with calm respect, explaining that Islam does not reject Jesus out of hatred or denial, but out of a deep commitment to the oneness of God, teaching that God is unique, eternal, and beyond human limitations, and that while Jesus is deeply honored, worship is reserved for God alone. And in this framework, Jesus is seen as a servant of God, a prophet sent to guide humanity, not as God himself. The audience listened closely, and even those who disagreed could not deny the sincerity and clarity of the explanation because it wasn't filled with anger or arrogance, but with reason, humility, and a genuine desire to build understanding. Then came another moment of shock when he revealed that Muslims believe Jesus will return at the end of time, not as a new prophet, but as a follower of the final message of God, to restore justice, defeat evil, and bring peace to the world. And when this was said, you could almost hear gasps across the room, because this belief sounded remarkably similar to Christian end times theology, and yet no one had ever connected the dots before. He explained that in Islamic teachings, Jesus will come back to correct misunderstandings about himself, break false idols, stand against oppression, and live as a righteous servant of God. And for many Christians in the audience, this was the moment that truly shook them, because it felt like discovering a hidden chapter in a book they thought they already knew by heart. The speaker then looked directly at the audience and said, "If Muslims and Christians both love Jesus, both believe in his miraculous birth, both honor his life, and both await his return, what is really dividing us?" And that question hung in the air like thunder because no one could answer it easily. The first part of the story ends here. With minds opened, hearts stirred, and a powerful sense that something much deeper and more transformative was about to be revealed. Because what comes next is the part that truly challenges long-held beliefs, confronts emotional barriers, and forces everyone, Christian and Muslim alike, to rethink what they thought they knew about faith, truth, and Jesus himself. As the second part of the talk unfolded, the atmosphere shifted from shock to deep emotional intensity. Because now the speaker wasn't just sharing facts, he was touching the core of people's beliefs, their identities, and their spiritual journeys. And he began by addressing the crucifixion, the single most sensitive and defining belief in Christianity. And when he said, Islam teaches that Jesus was not crucified in the way people think, you could feel the tension rise instantly, because this was the moment many Christians had been waiting for, and instead of dismissing their pain or faith, he approached it with profound empathy, explaining that Islam does not deny Jesus out of disrespect, but teaches that God protected him from such a humiliating death and raised him up, honoring him in a way that aligns with God's justice and mercy. And while many in the audience struggled to accept this idea, they couldn't ignore how respectfully it was presented. He then asked a deeply personal question that silenced the room. If God is all-powerful and deeply loving, would it be impossible for him to save his beloved prophet from execution? And that question lingered in the minds of everyone listening, because even those who didn't agree couldn't deny that it was logically compelling. He went on to explain that Islam sees the crucifixion story differently, not as a rejection of Jesus, but as a divine rescue, a moment where God intervened to protect his messenger. And while this view sharply contrasts with Christian theology, it reframes Jesus not as a defeated figure, but as a victorious one, preserved by God for a greater mission yet to come. Then he shifted the focus to something even more emotionally powerful, the idea that Muslims are commanded to love and respect Jesus, and that insulting him or denying his role as a prophet is considered a serious sin in Islam. And when this was said, some Christians visibly teared up, because they had grown up believing Muslims hated Jesus, and now they were hearing that loving Jesus is actually part of being a true Muslim. He quoted verses from the Quran that describe Jesus as a word from God and a spirit from him. And while Islam does not interpret these titles in the same way Christianity does, they still reflect an extraordinary level of honor and reverence, far beyond what most people ever imagined. Then came another emotional turning point when he talked about how political conflicts, media narratives, and historical wounds have distorted the image of Islam in the Western world, creating fear, suspicion, and hostility, and how Jesus of all figures should be the bridge that brings people together instead of pushing them apart. He said, if Jesus stood among us today, do you really think he would want Christians and Muslims fighting each other? Or would he want them standing side by side against injustice, hatred, and oppression? And that question hit like a lightning bolt, because it forced everyone to look beyond theology and into the moral heart of their faith. He shared stories of Muslims who grew up reciting prayers that mentioned Jesus with love and respect, of families who named their sons Isa to honor him, and of scholars who wrote entire books praising his character and teachings. And with every story, the image of Islam that many Christians held in their minds started to crumble, replaced by something far more nuanced and who. The speaker then addressed the idea of salvation, another major theological divide, and instead of attacking Christian beliefs, he explained Islam's view that salvation comes through faith in one God, righteous deeds, and sincere repentance, and that Jesus himself, in Islamic tradition, taught people to worship God alone, to care for the poor, to show humility, and to seek forgiveness, values that align closely with the moral teachings found in the Gospels. He said, when Muslims follow Jesus, they follow him as a prophet who called people to God, not as a God himself. And while this statement sparked internal resistance for many Christians, it also sparked deep reflection, because it challenged them to separate their emotional attachment to doctrine from the historical message of Jesus as a teacher of righteousness. As the second part came to a close, the audience was no longer just shocked. They were emotionally shaken, because the image of Islam as an enemy of Jesus had been completely dismantled, replaced with a vision of a faith that honors him deeply, even if it interprets his role differently. And in that moment it became clear that the real shock was not what Islam says about Jesus, but how badly this truth had been hidden from the world for so long. In the final part of the talk, the speaker slowly brought everything together in a way that felt less like a debate and more like a heartfelt awakening. and he began with a sentence that instantly silenced the entire room. The real tragedy is not that Christians and Muslims disagree about Jesus, it's that they don't even understand what the other side actually believes. And in that moment, a deep, uncomfortable truth settled over everyone, because for the first time they realized that most of their fear, anger, and suspicion had been built not on facts, but on assumptions passed down through generations, reinforced by headlines, politics, and pain rather than honest learning. He reminded the audience that throughout history, religion has often been hijacked by power-hungry leaders and extremists who use sacred names for selfish goals, turning faith into a weapon instead of a healing force. And he asked a question that cut straight to the heart. What would happen if we stopped using Jesus as a reason to fight and started using him as a reason to heal? And suddenly the room felt heavy with reflection, because everyone knew deep down that Jesus himself would never have wanted his name to be used to justify hatred, violence, or endless division. He then turned directly to Christians in the audience, not with criticism, not with pressure, but with genuine compassion, and said, "You don't have to become Muslim to appreciate how Islam honors Jesus. And Muslims don't have to become Christian to respect your love for him." And that sentence alone felt revolutionary, because it challenged the idea that understanding the other side somehow weakens your own faith, when in reality, true faith, could be strong enough to face questions, differences, and uncomfortable truths without collapsing. He spoke about how dialogue is more powerful than debate, how listening is more transformative than shouting, and how humility is more convincing than arrogance. And as he said these words, the emotional energy in the room shifted from tension into something that felt almost sacred, like people were no longer trying to defend their identities, but were finally allowing themselves to simply understand one another. He then shared a deeply moving story about a Christian woman who once approached him after a similar talk, tears in her eyes, her voice shaking, saying, "I spent my whole life thinking Muslims hated Jesus, and now I feel like I've been lied to." And as he repeated her words, you could feel the pain behind them, the grief of someone realizing that years of fear had been built on a misunderstanding, and many people in the audience nodded silently because they felt the same heartbeat rising in their own chests at that exact moment. He followed this with a message to Muslims in the room and watching online, reminding them of their enormous responsibility to represent Islam, not with anger, defensiveness, or superiority, but with patience, kindness, and wisdom, because every harsh word pushes people further away from the truth, while every act of compassion pulls them closer. And he said, "If you truly love Jesus, as Islam commands you to, then show that love through your character, your mercy, and your humility." And that message struck hard because it made it clear that faith is not proven by slogans but by behavior. He then returned to Jesus himself, describing him as the ultimate bridge between the two faiths, a figure both Christians and Muslims revere for his purity, his courage, his devotion to God, and his compassion for the weak. And he said something that made many people visibly emotional. If Jesus walked into this room right now, he wouldn't ask you what label you wear. He would ask you how you treat the poor, how you speak to your enemies, and how sincerely you seek God. And that sentence landed like a thunderbolt, because it forced everyone to look beyond theology and into the moral heart of their own lives. He reminded them that in both Christianity and Islam, Jesus stands as a symbol of moral excellence, self-sacrifice, and deep spiritual devotion, and that if his followers truly honored him, they would strive to embody those same values instead of using his name as a shield for hatred or arrogance. As the climax of the talk approached, he delivered one of the most unforgettable lines of the entire speech. If Christians really knew what Islam says about Jesus, and if Muslims really understood how deeply Christians love him, the world would look very different. And in that moment, the audience erupted into applause, not because every disagreement had been resolved, but because something far more important had happened. Hearts had been opened, walls had cracked, and a sense of shared humanity had finally begun to break through decades of fear. He then addressed the online viewers directly, his voice softening, his tone turning deeply personal, and said, "If you're watching this and you feel angry, confused, or defensive right now, that's okay. It means something inside you is waking up." And that message resonated deeply because it validated the emotional struggle people were feeling instead of shaming them for it. He urged everyone to go home and read the Quran's chapter about Mary, to read what Islam actually says about Jesus instead of relying on secondhand opinions. and to talk to people of other faiths with curiosity instead of suspicion. And he emphasized that seeking truth should never feel like betrayal, because real truth only makes your faith deeper, not weaker. Then he said something that completely reframed the entire conversation. My goal today is not to convert anyone. It's to liberate you from ignorance. And those words hit with incredible force because they made it clear that the real enemy was not Christianity, not Islam, but misinformation itself. He spoke about how children are often taught who to fear before they're taught how to think, how stereotypes are easier to inherit than facts, and how breaking those mental chains requires courage, humility, and emotional honesty. And as he said this, many people in the audience wiped away tears because they realized how much of their worldview had been shaped by narratives they had never questioned. He reminded them that both Muslims and Christians believe in a final judgment, a day when every soul will stand before God alone, without labels, without excuses, and without inherited beliefs to hide behind. And he asked, on that day, will God ask you what religion your neighbor followed, or how you treated them? And that question echoed in the silence like a moral hammer, because everyone knew the answer deep down. As he moved toward the final moments, his voice grew quieter but more intense, and he said, Jesus does not belong to one religion. He belongs to all who love God and seek truth. And when he said this, the entire room fell into stunned silence, because the simplicity of the statement carried immense spiritual weight. He concluded by saying that the purpose of his talk was not to erase differences, not to blur theology, and not to pretend disagreements don't exist, but to replace fear with knowledge, hatred with empathy, and arrogance with humility. And he urged everyone listening to walk away not with anger, but with questions, not with pride, but with curiosity, and not with division, but with a renewed commitment to peace. His final words were slow, deliberate, and unforgettable. The real shock is not what Islam says about Jesus. The real shock is how close we are, and how much pain we've caused each other by refusing to understand that. And as those words echoed through the hall, many people sat in silence long after the applause ended, realizing that they had just witnessed something far more powerful than a religious debate. They had witnessed a moment of awakening, a moment where centuries of misunderstanding cracked open, and a moment that might just change how they see Jesus, Islam, Christianity, and each other forever.